All right, good afternoon. Wow, this microphone's nice. Okay. I'm going to call to order this regular meeting of the Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management Committee. Today is March 23rd, 2016. I'm Councilmember Belong Yang, Chair of this committee. With me today are Council Members Palmisano, Gordon, Quincy, and Council President Johnson. Today we have 10 items on our agenda, of which 9 are consent items, and the 10th is a discussion item. And I will read through this really quickly, and then we will address the consent items first before we go to the discussion item. The first item is a contract with the University of Minnesota for MPD SWAT officers to provide extra security at TCF Stadium for up to 14 large-scale events in 2016. Second item is a contract with the University of Minnesota for SWAT officers to provide extra security at TCF Stadium during 2 2015 Gopher football games and 4 2015 Vikings football game. And if you notice, this is 2015, so just for games that have happened already. Number 3 is a contract with the Downtown Improvement District for police officers' assistance for the 2016 Minneapolis DID Summer Police and Police Reserve Program. Item number 4 is a contract with Hennepin Technical College for cadet recruit training in spring of 2016. The next item is a contract amendment with the University of Minnesota for extra security services during NHL Stadium Series alumni game at TCF Stadium, and I believe this happened already as well. Sixth item is a contract amendment with the University of Minnesota for bomb detection at TCF Stadium. Seventh item, contract amendment with Corner House Interagency Child Abuse Evaluation and Training Center for forensic interview services. Eighth item is a grant acceptance from the United States Marshal Services for a vehicle. And the ninth item is a RFP issuance for consultants, event planners for 2018 Super Bowl. Council members, any questions on those 9 consent items? All right, seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, the motion carries. All right, and then we have the 10th item, which is the Office of Police Conduct Review Annual Reports, and this is the annual report for 2015. And today we have, Commander Case and Imani Jafar who are doing the presentation, and feel free, whoever is going to do the presentation first.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Yang, council members, the Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management Committee. My name is Imani Jafar. I'm the Director of the Office of Police Conduct Review in the Department of Civil Rights. Today, I'm pleased to be presenting the 2015 annual report to you. I will be presenting along with a few co-presenters that I'll introduce as I continue with the presentation. So we'll begin. So our first slide here is going to show the discipline types that have been issued by the chief over the last year. These cases were cases that all flowed through the OPCR process. If you look at the graphic there, you can see that there were 6 coaching or corrective action cases, which will give you more detail about that process later, 6 written reprimands, 5 suspensions, and 2 termination cases. Next year, these numbers are going to provide an even more robust picture because of some of the current process improvements that we're making, and we'll discuss that a little bit later in the presentation. The next slide deals with policy violations in coaching, or it is also known as corrective action. You can see that they're broken down by precinct here. An important note about corrective action is that the joint supervisors, which consist of myself and Commander Jason Case of Internal Affairs, personally review each coaching document to make sure that it's up to the standard that is set for coaching documents. If we receive a document that's not up to that standard, that document is then sent back to the precinct to be redone and resubmitted to us to make sure that all coaching documents are fully executed. Coaching or corrective action is only used for lower level violations. An example of that is when a complainant may come to OPCR saying that an officer was rude during an interaction, or maybe an officer was speeding through a neighborhood. So corrective action is really meant for a lower level type of violation. Yes?
Councilmember Gordon.
I just want To ask more specifically, lower level violation, aren't the violations ranked in alphabetical sequence somehow? And is the code, could you just let us know what level then is the cutoff for coaching? And once it's past that level, it can't be coaching?
There's not a specific cutoff, but it's intended for what would probably be referred to as an A-level violation or a lower level violation. So it's not intended for something that you may traditionally think of as a more serious violation. So again, things like, rudeness, attitude, speeding, those are a classic example, but you're looking at A-level violations.
And we don't think it's been used for a B, C, or D level violation ever?
Well, I wouldn't say ever, because there are cases that may have been a more serious violation, but maybe outside of what they consider the reckoning period, which is the amount of time that discipline is allowed to be executed on those. So it would be a complaint that is well outside of that time period, can also be sent to coaching. So a nice feature of that is otherwise nothing could be done, right? Because outside of the reckoning, but instead, at least a supervisor can have a conversation with an officer about something that may have been more serious, but is outside a wide time frame. But otherwise, for current complaints, you're really looking at low-level violations.
Maybe I could ask a question about the first slide too, because I did have one.
Sure.
Is that all right?
Sure.
So I noticed on the first slide, there was a discipline that was issued, says other. And of course, I was curious about what other is, because the other ones were clear. Do you remember what that was, or why it says other and it doesn't tell us?
Give me a moment here. A 90-day prohibition on off-duty work.
Okay. So
There's the
creative discipline. All right, thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Okay, so the next slide here is you can see that the type of the complaints filed and the numbers. I wanted to draw your attention to this slide is a little bit different than it's appeared in years past, because we actually pulled out the complaints without jurisdiction. So you can see what's an example of a complaint outside of jurisdiction. Well, for example, if a complainant comes and files something against a Metro Transit officer or someone from Park Police, we occasionally even get people who file complaints about officers in other states. Those are things that we cannot handle. However, those complaints are still looked at by the joint supervisors and made sure to make a determination that it's not within the jurisdiction. The blue bar there are all the complaints within the jurisdiction that were reviewed. So a total of those two are 344 complaints that were reviewed over the past year. The next slide is the allegation type, and you can see it broken down here. The first category is the violation of the policy manual, which is essentially a catch-all category for any violation that's not covered in the other categories. An example of that would be normal vehicle operation use or reporting the use of force. Those are things that might fall into the violation of a policy manual. The other categories here you can see inappropriate language and attitude, excessive use of force, failure to provide protection, harassment, theft, discrimination, and criminal misconduct. These categories are defined by the OPCR for reporting and are intended to work in concert with the Minneapolis Police Department's Policy and Procedure Manual. The next slide shows the case resolution, and you can see that overall here, we have 70% of the cases that flow through the OPCR process that are within jurisdiction are sent to investigation, mediation, or go through the corrective action process. One important point here that I would like to mention that will be discussed a little further is that we have a goal timeline for completion of 120 days as part of our new process improvements, and we're hoping that that will help build public trust, that people know when they file a complaint that it will be dealt with in a timely manner. The next slide is the review panel. To give you a little background on the review panels consist of 2 civilians who are appointed by the city council and the mayor, and 2 sworn officers that will sit down together and review cases that have flowed through that point in the OPCR process. Over the past year, there's been 32 cases reviewed by the panel. Of those, only 1 had a disagreement between the panelists, and in that instance, the chief of police sided with the civilian's decision on that case. Another feature here that I'd like to draw your attention to is the Q4 numbers. You can see that there's kind of a jump in that number. That's not an accident. Between that time, one new process improvement that we started was to preset the review panels out for an entire year. And the idea there is that way the panels are preset, and as cases come forward, they can be heard in an efficient manner so that cases can be resolved in a timely manner. So here you can see that by Q4, 22 merit allegations here, and those cases there were all heard by that review panel. So with that mention of process changes, I'd actually like to continue to the next slide and invite up the next presenters, Commander Jason Case of Internal Affairs, who is my counterpart, and I'll let him talk about the process improvements.
Good afternoon. As Director Jafar mentioned, we are looking, when we first started, was back in October, when I took over a role as Internal Affairs and really started looking at some of the things that we could do to increase efficiency in the processes. We had always been investigating things fully, and they all went through the process, but there are some tweaks that we could make to the process. One of the things that we're going to be doing is looking at what the Office of Justice Program Diagnostic Group came in and said are some highlights that we can look at. One of those things includes the discipline process of how it flows after the case is completed. One of the other things that she mentioned was the amount of time that it takes a case to go through the life of the case. We've set a standard of 120 days. Now what that means is 120 days from the time that the case was assigned to the investigator. But it gives us a time frame not only for us, but also for the citizen who made the complaint as a guide. Sometimes that might fall outside that 120 days, but the idea is to be able to provide some type of feedback along the way so that they can track where things are at. And then one of the other things that we're going to be doing is a new way or a new approach to dealing with the information that's learned about the complaint, and specifically, the where, the who, why did it occur, and then take that information and report back on it in a more, impactful way. And we refer to it as data or data mapping. And to talk more about that is our law enforcement analyst, Ryan Patrick.
Chair Yang, council members. One of the new things we've been doing with our data that we've been collecting and investigating, but taking a new step, and that's plotting out the coordinates of where these incidents take place on a map on an ongoing basis. This will allow us to identify patterns by shift where lots of complaints seem to be popping up, and if we start to see a lot of deviation in those, we might be able to go out to the precinct and have a chat with some of the people working that shift, take a proactive step to see what's going on. Of course, we're still investigating the cases that come through at that time, but we can also address some of the bigger pictures of ideas. The other way we can look at this data is figuring out where there are lots of law enforcement contacts but no complaints. We might be able to identify some of the underserved communities, get out and do community outreach and engagement, but also identify some of the strategies that officers are using in those areas that are leading to a more positive relationship with the community. So I, along with the Police Conduct Oversight Commission, we're taking these more proactive steps, trying to use our data in innovative ways to identify patterns and use them effectively. With that, I'd like to introduce Commissioner Jennifer Singleton, who's going to be talking about some of the Police Conduct Oversight Commission's activities in 2015.
Councilmember Gordon.
I just wanted to ask more about the mapping because it's very interesting, but I realize this is the only slide representing the mapping. Is that right?
Correct.
But you said you also have a corresponding map about police stops, so you can compare that with complaints?
We, Chair Yang, Councilmember Gordon, we have a lot of data that comes from the police department about law enforcement contacts, and we also generate data as a result of some of the studies that come out of the Police Commission. All of this information that we're absorbing and using can be used as overlays with the complaint mapping to try and develop some patterns and better understanding about what's happening at a citywide level.
Yeah, it's incredibly interesting. So is this map actually conveying any real information?
These maps are, so the process.
This particular one, I mean?
The process that I used to develop this map was I modified the addresses so that it wasn't exact pinpoints, but rather intersections. I made the map and I posted it, linked to it in the report that anyone can look at online. You click on the link, you go to the map, you can actually look and zoom into individual neighborhoods and areas and see where the complaints are happening in that.
And these are the complaints
region.
from 2015?
These are the 2015 complaints, yes.
That's what I wanted to know. And you also have a map for each shift within each precinct that the precinct commanders or the inspectors could look at and use?
Chair Yang, Councilmember Gordon. We can change the color of the pins given any number of different variables. One of those could be the time of day that the complaint occurred, and that would help us identify what shift was actually working during the time that that complaint occurred.
Well, if we weren't in more of a dignified setting, I could share with you my excitement a little bit more accurately about this really cool and neat tool that you've developed, and this seems like a very significant improvement, and I'm excited about potentially learning more about it in the future, but it just seems like for the PCOC and also for the police department, this is a new product that could yield many benefits.
Thank you.
Chair Yang and council members, thank you for having me here today. As Mr. Patrick said, I'm Jennifer Singleton. I'm the Vice Chair of the Police Conduct Oversight Commission, and I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of our activities during the past year. During the past year, we reviewed over 100 case synopses and over 30 case summaries. Case synopses are one paragraph summaries, or one paragraph descriptions of cases of police misconduct. And at each of our monthly meetings, we look at 10 of those cases that have been randomly selected from cases that are closed within the past 3 months. So I know that's a lot. But out of those 10 synopses that we look at every meeting, we choose 3 cases that we want to take a deeper dive into looking at. And those are the case summaries that we look at. And these synopses and summaries really help to guide the research that we do and help us determine what issues might need further study. So I'll talk about 3 of the more in-depth studies that we conducted during 2015, which I think you're aware of already, so I'll just, I won't go into too many details. The first one was the investigative stop documentation study, which we reported to you folks here with the committee on. And I'm happy to say that the recommendations that we issued, the heart of those recommendations was adopted by MPD. And so now MPD will be documenting all investigative stops, and we'll also be gathering demographic data on those stops. And MPD has actually gone one step further, and they're rolling out a software tweak that requires an officer to enter all of that information into the document management system before moving on to the next stop. So that'll make sure that we're really gathering all of that data. The next study I want to mention is the Doesn't Fit Any Crime study. And this was a study that, an issue that was brought to us by the ACLU. And in their study called Picking Up the Pieces, they came across a category of arrests that were coded as doesn't fit any crime, and were reasonably concerned that these were unlawful arrests given the title of that category. So we took a deeper dive into those arrests, and we're able to verify that that was just a poor choice of words for a miscellaneous category, and that those arrests were actually made pursuant to suspected violation of a crime. The third study, which I know you're all aware of, is the body camera study. We did an exhaustive review of best practices. We looked at what other jurisdictions were doing, and we also conducted community outreach to get a sense of what community members felt in terms of body camera policy. We issued those recommendations in September, I believe, and we are hopeful that we'll be able to continue working with the police department to make sure that many of the accountability measures that were included in that recommended policy and many of the provisions that were there to increase public trust in the use of body cameras, those get included in the final policy. A lot of those have not been included in the draft. So we're still in dialogue with MPD on that and hope to remain active in that process. The final kind of prong of PCOC activities from 2015 are outreach activities. In addition to the 3 community sessions that we had specific to body cameras, we conducted 7 outreach events that were just more general outreach to talk to folks about their interactions with the police and let them know about the Police Conduct Oversight Commission. I think that's notable given that in 2015, we were working with 6 commissioners. We're volunteer commissioners, so we have day jobs, other lives. And we were able to be out for several of the Open Streets events, for the Cinco de Mayo event on Lake Street, for the Community Connections Conference, which is coming up again this year, and for the West Bank Riverside Community Block Party. So we're hopeful to continue these activities and the 3 different areas that I talked about with the remainder of 2016. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Ms. Singleton, I have a question for you. With regards to the police body cam policy, I mean, what is the PCOC's role in that? I mean, is it advisor? Are you recommending policies? I mean, what is your role in the context of that?
So in earlier, I think it was May, maybe 2015, Mayor Hodges and Chief Harteau asked us to conduct a study into best practices and particularly to get community input. So we completed that study in 2015, and along with that study, we provided a recommended policy. So that's our recommended policy that we would, best case scenario, want MPD to implement before they continued on with the rollout of body cameras. Since then, we had Deputy Chief Arredondo at our meeting last month to present the draft body camera policy. And then we've tried to have a commissioner present, available and present at each of the community sessions that MPD is putting on with NCR. Just given the timelines, we weren't able to take any official action to partner with MPD on that. And also given our constraints as volunteers. But we are discussing whether the PCOC should have a PCOC-led community session to really present where the divergences are between the recommended policy and the draft policy and get further feedback from the community.
Okay, and let's just assume that with the recommendations, I mean, MPD takes a look at your recommendations, adopts some of them, and some of it they just don't adopt. I mean, is there a threshold where, let's say, PCOC just is not happy with that, and we need to put the brakes on, or where are we on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll have to see what MPD, what revisions MPD makes. I know that they've said that they're open and that this is just a draft. It's still a document in motion. So I think that's something that we'll have to see, but we'll certainly be discussing it at the PCOC meetings and be giving input and and we'd be happy to come back to Public Safety Committee to share with you kind of our official thoughts
Okay.
on the policy.
Councilmember Palmisano?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's okay with you. I have a couple questions for
Sure.
Ms. Singleton. Ms. Singleton, I'm curious what you mentioned. Would this be an additional recommendation that PCOC would go back out and work with the community? Because it's my understanding that you already did that.
Yeah, we did already do that during our study, but we do feel that it's important, or at least, let me step back. I feel it's important for the commission. I can't speak for the commission since we haven't taken formal action on this, but I think it's important for us to continue to be a part of the conversation. So I think that now that there's a draft policy out, it makes sense for the commission to be out there talking to the community about the draft.
And then, if I may, Ms. Singleton, I was there last fall, late summer, fall, when you presented back your recommendations after that engagement back into the body camera policy. Have you received anything back from the police department at that point, or from the mayor and the police chief, or the ones that asked you to go out and for you to be their proxy in the community and get this input? Or are there just now like 2 different versions of the body camera policy floating? One is the police version that they're going out into the community asking for input on, and one is the draft that's still sitting, the draft or the markup, I guess I would call it, because you put all of your thoughts clearly into places in this body camera policy. Have they ever explained to you why they couldn't take some of these changes, or has that conversation taken place yet?
I think we've started to have that conversation. I think it will continue, but I would say that conversation started at our March meeting, March 8th, where DC Arredondo was there, and we were able to ask him why certain recommendations that we had made were not included in the policy, in the draft policy.
Thank you.
And Ms. Singleton, let me ask you, I mean, ultimately, who makes the final call on what the policy is? Is it MPD? Is it the mayor? Is it the city council? Is it PCOC?
think that's a complicated question. I know it doesn't seem complicated. I think, the MPD can create their final policy. I think that the mayor obviously is ahead of the chief in the chain of command. So I think she could have some say. I think that city council also holds the purse strings to the money. So I think that you also have input. And I think that the PCOC is an important voice of the community. So I think that while our recommendations aren't binding, and that's clearly in our ordinance, I think that that it behooves the MPD to listen to the recommendations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any questions?
That concludes our presentation of the Office of Police Conduct's work to try to provide meaningful civilian oversight in the city of Minneapolis. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Jafar, we have some questions.
Yes.
Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Farr, I have a letter sitting on my desk for a very long time. I hate to admit it. No, I was cleaning my desk off the other day and I found it. Do we have a restriction on who can serve on the PCOC as far as former city employees or former police officers or something like that? Do you remember?
Chair Yang, Council President Johnson, I don't believe there's a restriction on that other than living in the city of Minneapolis. If they were no longer a resident, that would be a problem. But other than that, I don't believe there's a restriction, no.
Okay, then maybe it was a different committee or something, but anyway.
They would still need to go through the application process and then go through an interview process and then still go through the approval process where they are either put forward by the city council or the mayor. So there is a process at only certain points in the year where new commissioners, if there are seats available, are able to proceed with that process.
Okay. Well, I'm going to have to dig further and get my facts together. Thank you, though.
You're welcome.
Councilmember Gordon.
I had a question about this year compared with other years, and it's something that's sometimes nice to see in the reports, is how things like the complaints or where the complaints have come from. But I'm also curious about the discipline issued. It actually looked to me when that first slide that there may have been more discipline issued this year than there was maybe last year or 3 years ago, or maybe even under the old system where we used to always, seems like, hit some kind of log jam at the former chiefs, mostly, I think all former chiefs, desk or the process that they had in place about this. And I know there aren't slides and you might not know this specifically right now, but maybe you could just share if you think it's going more smoothly and that discipline decisions are getting made in a more timely manner and there are more discipline issues that are being decided, if that's what you're aware of, because that's what that first slide gave me the impression about.
Chair Yang, Councilmember Gordon, what I can say is I don't have the specific data. I'm sure I could get that together for you if you wish and give that to you at a later time. However, more specifically, I can say that the new process improvements that we discussed throughout the presentation, I believe, are making the complaints go through in a more timely manner and in a couple of different ways. The 120-day timeline, having the review panels set out a year in advance so that cases are moved through at a better pace. All of those things are resulting, and I think that quarter 4 slide that we shared with you is really indicative of that. So I would say from the process improvement that's happening, the cases are moving through at a pace where discipline can be given by the chief in what I would say is a more timely manner. I can give you just a small example that there was a little bit of a backlog of cases when Commander Case and I started in October. However, that backlog was worked on significantly from a rough estimate of 130 cases down to 30. So there are definitely things in place to make that go through. Another process improvement is making sure that we have a full-time intake investigator through the Office of Police Conduct Review, which really impacts getting the complainants in and moving that process forward, which we do have.
And I think we used to also run into problems with this reckoning period where it would take so long, whether it was at the far end when it got up to the chief to make a determination, I'm not sure where. But have we had any problems last year where some complaints weren't processed in time and so that they actually got to the chief's desk outside the reckoning period?
Chair Yang, Councilmember Gordon, I would probably have to look through specific numbers and get back to you on that. But my understanding moving forward is that we're sticking to the 120-day timeline would put that well within the reckoning period, and that the goal is to not have that be an issue moving forward.
That's excellent. And I just had a couple more questions or comments. One was, we used to get reports and there was a little bit more demographic information about the complainant. We especially, I think sometimes would look at if the complainants were people of color or if they weren't. I know that you also have a map that was showing where they come from, and there was a precinct bar graph, so that was helpful, which we also got. But sometimes I don't really remember. I'd have to look back if they were looking at times of day or some kind of other analysis. That might be something that would be interesting to me, at least. I don't know if the whole committee needs to see it in the reports. My thought might be that we could have some kind of discussion outside of the committee about what could be in the quarterly reports and what isn't. And hopefully I didn't miss anything that was in there and just refer to it as being missing when it was actually there. But, and my last question, and you don't necessarily have to answer this or not, but we used to hear sometimes that there weren't enough investigators, and that was also part of the problem. And do you think that you have enough investigators now, or how's your staff holding up under the workload?
Chair Yang, Councilmember Gordon, I'll address your questions in the two prongs. So the first issues you brought up, we are really hoping, and the reason that we included the mapping in the 2015 report is to show you where we hope to go. And one thing we'd really like to do is really get more information about where the complaints are coming from, who is filing them. And the whole idea is so that we can go out and work with community groups and the Minneapolis Police Department to help look at, are there concentrations of complaints with concentrations of people that need to be addressed? I think that falls under kind of the idea of early intervention. You know, can you really get the problem at a stem? And I think that's the idea there. The second part is, you may be aware that when a complainant files a complaint with the Office of Police Conduct Review, they get a choice of a sworn, a police investigator, or a civilian investigator. However, we only have 2 civilian investigators who are able to investigate cases. You know, with the mapping technology, with an increased emphasis on community outreach, we're hoping that the complaints will only probably increase just because people are more aware of our work. With that, I think that probably a new investigator is very needed. The 2 investigators that we have right now have a pretty good caseload because there's only 2 of them. And when the public is aware that they may choose a civilian, people do opt for that option. So, you know, that's definitely something that we would think about for future growth.
So you have 2 civilian investigators, and how many sworn investigators are available?
I believe there's 9 right now.
There's 9. And as far as you know, is everyone who requests a civilian investigator able to get a civilian investigator?
Yes, unless they're on the type of cases that only can go through internal affairs. And those type of cases are, for example, a criminal allegation, a respect in the workplace type of violation, and something that involves a civilian employee. Those cases have to go through internal affairs. Otherwise, they do get a civilian investigator, and we work very hard to make sure that those cases are addressed in a timely fashion. We do have another investigator who is the intake investigator. That person's sole job is to take in the complaints, process them, prepare them for the joint supervisor's review, and work through that process.
Okay, thank you so much for all the details. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Councilmember Quincy?
First of all, thanks very much for this presentation, Mr. Chair. It's a great report. It's leading to more questions, and so I think that just doesn't represent the fact that there's missing information. I think it just is a real compliment to the topic and the way it's been handled. I guess I had a couple of questions. First of all, the numbers that are reported in terms of discipline and number of complaints, those are actually only numbers of complaints filed through the police conduct review. Is that correct?
Chair Yang, Councilmember Quincy, that is correct. Forward thinking, if this helps you see that we are actually, Internal Affairs is starting a new reporting process. So we hope to be able to present these numbers alongside one another because Office of Police Conduct Review and Internal Affairs really do work in concert. Right. So to present our numbers without their numbers, especially when we're considered joint supervisors, is difficult, but we're changing that. So that the hope is by the 2016 presentation, you're going to see those numbers together. So it will definitely give you a more comprehensive picture.
Exactly my point and thought is this is just represents the people who have gone through this process. Someone comes into the precinct, makes a direct complaint to the the sergeant at the desk. Where does that go? Is that part of these numbers? No, it's part of the internal affairs, or it's just handled there, and it's not even tabulated or calculated. So it's always interesting to know this is just represents one part of our discipline process and our complaint-driven process. The other question I had is, how is the public informed to make these complaints through this process?
Chair Yang, Councilmember Quincy. So there is information on the website. There is information that's provided through community outreach, both through the Office of Police Conduct Review, Internal Affairs, as well as the Department of Civil Rights. We do our best to get the information out, but we're actually putting together a very strategic community outreach plan to be able to reach more communities. One wonderful thing about the mapping is that we can start to see specifically what communities and areas need that outreach. So we're really trying to do very thoughtful, targeted outreach. When we go out into the community, things that can be provided are sample complaint forms. They get brochures. A lot of people opt for the online. We even do outreach within the legal community so that lawyers that work with clients who may need this information understand that they can come to our website, they can come to our office. So there's kind of a broad-based outreach right now. We're even doing outreach within precincts with internal affairs to make sure that the police department fully understands how to get people into that process if they're requesting it. And it's been a really nice collaborative effort, but moving forward, that's how we're proceeding.
Okay, thank you. My final thought is about the graphs themselves. When we're reporting numbers, are these mutually exclusive, or could somebody have for example, on the one on discipline types issued by chief, could you have a training, coaching, and a written reprimand and be represented twice, or is it only one person per incident?
Chair Yang, Councilmember Quincy, my understanding is it's only one incident, so I don't think they would be represented twice. A coaching document is still a formal document, and that's going to be available in that file. So that's why they're reviewed in that certain manner to make sure that the joint supervisors, review them to make sure that they're up to standard, because that is something that would be available.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Farr, I have a few questions. Can you explain to us, with regards to OPCR and PCOC, what's the connection? Is PCOC kind of like an advisory board of sorts, or what is it in relationship to OPCR?
Chair Yang, that's an excellent question. The Police Conduct Oversight Commission does work with the Office of Police Conduct Review. However, they are an independent body, so they are making their own decisions. They will occasionally utilize resources from the Office of Police Conduct Review when they're requesting a study or work, but their recommendations that go forward, the Office of Police Conduct Review will support their work when appropriate, but they kind of function independently, and then they can also make their recommendations and work directly with the police department, which I think Commissioner Singleton did a nice job of mentioning how that work intersects.
Okay, and so let me ask you this, and this is not meant to be mean or anything. More so just, under the ordinance, the PCOC is supposed to do a report to us at some point, and I don't recall them doing a report to us, but here they are, presenting with OPCR. I'm wondering, is that supposed to satisfy the ordinance, or can we get an independent report at some point? Or
Chair Yang, if you'd like an independent report, that is definitely something that I would be happy to relay, through Commissioner Singleton to the chair of the Police Conduct Oversight Commission. We wanted to include them today because we didn't want to talk about their work. We wanted them to come talk about their work.
Okay.
But we would definitely be, I'm sure Chair Andrea Brown would be very open to coming and presenting to you, and I think that would be a wonderful opportunity.
Okay, I need to refresh myself on the ordinance and what it requires, but yeah, that's important. And then just with regards to your annual report, I'm looking at page 5, which is the policy violations regarding coaching by precincts. And I'm just wondering, just thinking out loud here, with regards to the different precincts, the numbers are fairly negligible in terms of, which precinct and all that stuff. But I'm just wondering if at some point any context is important for people to understand, why there are like higher numbers in one precinct versus another versus the other category where, you see the blue, there's 5, but in terms of policy violations, there are more than any other precincts combined. And just wondering, without folks knowing, to see that, it just seems like the numbers are jarring with that context. And I'm wondering if context is important in that situation.
And I think, Chair Yang, so one thing that's important to note today, we're showing the graphics, but the annual report actually has text in it, and that's available online for people to read if they wish. I think that can vary. Those type of numbers vary year by year. It's kind of dependent on a variety of factors. However, moving forward, I think that to go to that concern, when we have the mapping, we can provide more. You can see more about, okay, are these coming out for a certain reason? Do people in that precinct just know that they can file those type of things? Is that why that's happening? Or is there a specific individual who's involved in complaints over and over again? And again, I think these are things that both the Minneapolis Police Department as well as our office are committed to figuring out and getting to the root of if it becomes a kind of chronic problem.
Right. And, my last question is, in 2013, there was a report by the SRIB saying, in headlines, it says, no Minneapolis cops have been disciplined after 439 complaints. And I'm wondering what the numbers are now relative to then, and or in general context, like since OPCR has opened up its doors, what the numbers are generally speaking, just so that because for myself, like every time we have a public hearing, every time we do anything here in public safety, those numbers are still quoted, and I think those numbers are in some ways obsolete in the sense that, there's been about 3 years that have passed since then, but people continue to quote the Star Tribune on this. And, I'm just wondering, can we get that number just for folks, just so that people know, what's happened since? Because, if the numbers are zero, at least we know that that's the case.
And Chair Yang, the numbers aren't zero. And I think the problem is that people that are coming to kind of make that claim that there's no discipline, often what I've found in conversations I've had in the community is that people believe that anything short of termination isn't discipline. And that's problematic because, as you can see from the chart, there are several things that are, corrective action isn't technically considered discipline, but an officer has to come sit with their supervisor, have a report written, and have it reviewed by the joint supervisor. So they are going through corrective action. But even take that piece out. Let's look at the rest. You have written reprimands, suspensions, terminations. Those are all coming out of the Office of Police Conduct Review. And this report has terminations. If the past reports didn't have termination, I feel that there are certain lenses where people are looking at it saying, well, anything short of a termination isn't discipline. Well, that's just not true. When someone's suspended, when they're given a written reprimand, those are all considered discipline. And so I think it's important to look at the context of what they're looking at, kind of like you mentioned earlier. But I think that number isn't really accurate. And I hope that going forward, we can give you the graphics and the numbers to show you that discipline is occurring appropriately, and that a termination may not be the right situation in all situations, but when it is appropriate and when it's gone through the process and in a thoughtful way, that will be the end result. So
could we at some point in the very near future get that graph that explains to us, per year from 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, what the numbers are, so that at least the public knows that, this is what has happened. And, you can explain it in any sort of way, whether, it was coaching, and that doesn't include discipline, but, I've seen your fancy graphs. You can do that where you can represent that to folks so that, people can understand what's been going on with OPCR.
Chair Yang, we would be happy to work with you to get you some numbers. And I agree that it's all about public understanding, increases public trust, and makes civilian oversight meaningful. And so these are important things. And if that is what you'd like to see, then we can certainly work with your office to get that there. But what I want to make crystal clear is that discipline has been occurring as a result of cases that go through the Office of Police Conduct Review.
And I completely agree with you, but I think if there's no graph to show it, and if it's not written in the Star Tribune, it probably isn't true yet.
Chair Yang, I hear you, and we will work with your office, and we will get that addressed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Councilmember Gordon.
Just had a couple other comments, and on that note, I do think that this year there was, I think, 344 complaints, and I believe in that article they weren't looking at coaching. We could make the case coaching's different now. It's clearer than it was at the beginning when we started it, and we really had no idea what it meant. But so I see an increase, and maybe it's modest. Maybe if you looked at percentages, it would look better. But it's not that hundreds of officers are being disciplined or anything. It's not a third of the complaints, but I think it's been significant. I also wanted to just note that I was able to look up the code and find out a little bit more about the police conduct review panel, and the qualifications do include a stipulation about whether or not you're currently or formerly employed with the city of Minneapolis. It just says for qualifications, just for the record and everybody, all members shall be residents of the city. Individuals currently or previously employed by the Minneapolis Police Department are ineligible to serve as members of the pool. And of course, every panel has 2 currently serving officers and then 2 civilians. So that was something that was put into the ordinance. I don't know if we want to change it or not or anything like that, but at least it's in there. So we cleared that question up.
Chair Yang, Councilmember Gordon, thank you for the clarification. And we appreciated you participating in the process to select the current commissioners. And it's a very thorough process. So I think, so far it appears to be working well.
I think we got some great candidates. And I think what happened actually, well, I found out from the council president, we had a former police officer that is now retired and wanted to serve on the panel. And he's actually well respected. And so that's why the question has come up. Do we really have to say no to him? And then we do according to the rules right now.
Councilmember Quincy?
No, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair.
All right. Seeing no more comments or questions, I will move to receive this annual report from the Office of Police Conduct Review for 2015. Any discussion? All right. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. And with that, we are done with our business, and so I will adjourn this meeting. Thank you all.